Three black sisters vanished from Detroit in 1946, and for 41 years, their older brother Marcus Washington carried their disappearance like a stone in his chest. Now, at 62, sitting in his late mother's cramped apartment surrounded by decades of accumulated grief, he was about to discover that some stones, when finally turned over, revealed truths more terrible than the weight of not knowing. The cardboard box in his lap contained the remnants of Mama's life. Faded church programs, yellowed photographs, prescription bottles with labels too worn to read. Marcus had been avoiding this task for 3 months since the funeral, but the landlord's eviction notice gave him no choice. Everything had to go by Sunday. His hands moved mechanically through the memories until his fingers brushed against something unexpected. Hidden beneath a stack of utility bills was a small leather journal, its cover cracked and darkened with age. Marcus recognized the handwriting on the first page immediately, though seeing it made his stomach clench with old anger. Property of Pastor Elijah Thornton, Mount Calvary Baptist Church, Detroit, Michigan. The Lord's Work, 1946. Pastor Elijah, the man who had stolen his sisters and convinced an entire congregation it was God's will. Marcus opened the diary with trembling hands, and the familiar scent of old paper and fading ink transported him back 4 decades. The entries began innocuously enough, standard pastoral observations about sermons and church finances, but as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. References to the 3 flowers appeared with increasing frequency. God's special calling for young vessels. Mentions of a sacred mission that required pure hearts untainted by worldly corruption. March 15, 1946. The Washington girls show exceptional promise. Ruby's voice during hymns touches something divine. Pearl's devotion during prayer is remarkable for one so young. Little Opal possesses a spiritual sensitivity that could serve the Lord's highest purposes. I must pray for guidance on how best to cultivate these gifts. Marcus's vision blurred. After all these years of wondering, of searching, of asking God why his sisters had simply vanished after that Sunday service, the answer had been hiding in his mother's box of memories. Pastor Elijah hadn't just failed to protect them, he had planned something. The apartment's radiator clanked and hissed, but Marcus barely heard it. Outside, Detroit's March wind rattled the windows of the housing project where his mother had spent her final years, still waiting for her daughters to come home. Now Marcus understood why she had kept this diary hidden, why she had never spoken Pastor Elijah's name again after 1946. She had known the truth all along. The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow as he stared at the diary's pages. March 1946. He could see it all again with painful clarity, the way sunlight had streamed through Mount Calvary's stained glass windows that last Sunday morning, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews where his family sat in their usual spot, 3rd row from the front. Ruby had worn her blue dress with the white collar, the one Mama had sewn special for Easter service. At 19, she was the family's pride, with a voice that could make grown men weep during hymns. Pearl, 17 and serious beyond her years, had clutched her worn Bible like it contained all the answers to life's mysteries. And little Opal, just 15 but already showing signs of the beauty that would one day turn heads, had sat between her sisters with that dreamy expression she got during Pastor Elijah's sermons. Marcus remembered how Pastor Elijah had called them forward that morning. "The Washington sisters," he had announced in his deep, commanding voice that had held the congregation spellbound for nearly a decade. These young ladies have been chosen by the Almighty for a special mission, a calling that will take them far from Detroit to spread God's word where it's needed most. The congregation had erupted in praise. "Hallelujah," voices had shouted. "Blessed be." Mama had wept with pride, her hands raised toward heaven as her daughters stood before the altar, in their Sunday best, looking like angels in the morning light. "They'll be doing missionary work down south," Pastor Elijah had continued, his hand resting possessively on Ruby's shoulder, "training with other young women of faith to minister to those who need salvation most. It's a great honor, a great responsibility." Marcus had felt a cold knot form in his stomach even then, though he couldn't have explained why. At 21, he was old enough to recognize something false in Pastor Elijah's smile. something hungry in the way his eyes lingered on his sisters. But questioning a man of God wasn't something you did in Mama's house, and questioning him in front of the entire congregation was unthinkable. The last image Marcus had of his sisters was them walking toward Pastor Elijah's black Buick after service, their small suitcases in hand, turning to wave goodbye one final time. Ruby had blown him a kiss. Pearl had mouthed, "I love you." Hopewell had simply smiled, trusting and innocent. They had climbed into that car and vanished from the world as if they had never existed at all. The abandoned Mount Calvary Baptist Church sat like a rotting tooth on Hastings Street, its windows boarded, with plywood that bore decades of graffiti and weather stains. Marcus stood across the street, Pastor Elijah's diary clutched in his coat pocket, studying the building where his family's faith had been weaponized against them. The church had closed in 1963, 17 years after his sisters disappeared. The congregation had scattered when the truth about Pastor Elijah's financial irregularities finally surfaced. Missing building funds, forged documents, mysterious trips that no one could account for. But by then it was too late for the Washington family. Thought I might find you here. Marcus turned to see Deacon Williams approaching, his ancient frame bent with arthritis, but his eyes still sharp. At 84, Williams was one of the few remaining members of the original congregation, and the only one who had ever been willing to speak openly about Pastor Elijah's darker activities. Deacon Williams. Marcus nodded respectfully. "I found something I think you should see." Williams accepted the diary with gnarled hands, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he read. When he looked up, his face had aged another decade. "Sweet Jesus," Williams whispered. "Where did you find this?" "Hidden in Mama's belongings. She kept it all these years." Marcus studied the old man's face. "You knew, didn't you, about what he was really doing?" Williams closed the diary carefully as if it might burst into flames. "I suspected. Lord help me, I suspected, but I was too much of a coward to speak up. Pastor Elijah had such a hold on folks, such charisma. Anyone who questioned him was branded a troublemaker." "Tell me what you know." Williams glanced around nervously, though the street was empty except for a few abandoned cars. He had connections down south, rural churches, religious compounds where young women could be trained for missionary work. Said it was preparation for spreading the gospel in Africa, Asia, places where strong faith was needed. But they never came back. None of them ever. "Came back," Williams confirmed, his voice heavy with guilt. "Your sisters weren't the first, Marcus. There were others before them, girls from other churches across Detroit. Pretty girls, devout girls, girls whose families trusted Pastor Elijah with their daughters' souls." Marcus felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten. "How many others?" "I don't know for certain. Maybe a dozen over the years he preached here. All between 15 and 25, all described as having special callings for missionary work." Williams shook his head. "I tried once to ask questions, tried to contact one of those southern churches. Pastor Elijah found out and made it clear that my curiosity wasn't welcome." The old man handed back the diary with trembling fingers. "There's something else. A name I remember him mentioning. Eden's Rest. Said it was a training facility in Mississippi where young women learned to serve God's will completely." Marcus felt something shift inside him, a spark of purpose he hadn't experienced in decades. After 41 years of questions without answers, he finally had a trail to follow. Marcus waited until darkness fell before lighting the single candle on his kitchen table. Something about Pastor Elijah's diary demanded shadows, as if the words themselves were too vile to read under electric light. The flame cast dancing shadows across the walls of his small apartment as he opened to where he had left off, steeling himself for what lay ahead. April 3rd, 1946. The Negro race carries the mark of Ham's curse, but within this burden lies opportunity. Young women of color, properly guided, can achieve purification through dedicated service and sacrifice. Their natural submission to authority makes them ideal vessels for God's transformative work. Marcus's hands trembled as he read. This wasn't the Pastor Elijah who had thundered about God's love from Mount Calvary's pulpit. This was something else entirely, something that had hidden behind Scripture and righteousness. April 12, 1946, correspondence with Brother Matthias. At Eden's Rest confirms they have space for 3 new initiates. The Washington girls will serve well in the purification program. Ruby's pride will require extensive correction, but her voice will bring glory once properly humbled. Pearl's intellect must be redirected toward obedience. Young Opal shows promise for complete spiritual transformation. The candle flame flickered as Marcus turned the page, his breathing shallow. Each entry grew darker, more detailed in its descriptions of what Pastor Elijah called spiritual cleansing. References to disciplinary measures that would burn away worldly attachments. Mentions of isolation periods designed to break down resistance to divine will. May 1st, 1946, delivered the 3 flowers to Eden's Rest as planned. Brother Matthias assured me their training will be thorough. The compound's remote location ensures no worldly distractions during their transformation period. Their family's grief is temporary. They will understand when the girls return as pure servants of the Lord. But the girls had never returned. Marcus knew that with crushing certainty. The diary entries continued for months afterward, filled with Pastor Elijah's twisted justifications and increasingly unhinged theological arguments about racial superiority through suffering. August 15th, 1946. No word from Eden's Rest in 3 weeks. Brother Matthias's last letter mentioned Ruby required additional correction for defiance. Some vessels break before they are properly molded. The Lord's work demands such sacrifices. Marcus slammed. The diary shut, unable to read further. The candle's flame danced wildly in the sudden movement, throwing grotesque shadows across the room. His sisters hadn't vanished into some noble missionary calling. They had been delivered to monsters who believed their suffering was sanctified by twisted scripture. 41 years of wondering, and the truth was more horrific than anything he had imagined. But now he had a name, a location. Eden's Rest. Somewhere in Mississippi the answers waited. He blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, planning his journey south. The asphalt shimmered with heat mirages as Marcus drove his rusted Pontiac deeper into Mississippi's backwoods. Pastor Elijah's diary on the passenger seat, like a malevolent compass pointing toward truth. 3 days of driving through small towns with names like Mercy Creek and Salvation Bend had yielded nothing but suspicious stares and tight-lipped denials when he mentioned Eden's Rest. The gas station appeared like a mirage itself, a weathered building with 2 ancient pumps and a hand-painted sign that read, "Earl's Last Stop Gas and Sundries." Marcus pulled up to the pump, his car's engine ticking in the oppressive heat, and noticed an elderly black man sitting in a folding chair beside the station's entrance, whittling a piece of wood with practiced ease. "You lost, son?" the man asked, without looking up from his carving. His voice carried the weight of decades spent in these forgotten places, where secrets festered like untended wounds. "Looking for information about a place called Eden's Rest," Marcus replied, climbing out to pump gas. "Used to be run by a man named Pastor Elijah Thornton." The whittling stopped. The old man's weathered hands grew still, and when he finally looked up, Marcus saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition mixed with old fear. "Ain't nobody called that name around here in 40 years, the man said carefully. "What business you got stirring up that particular hornet's nest?" Marcus pulled out a faded photograph of his sisters, the last one taken before they disappeared. "He took them, my 3 sisters, told our church they were going to missionary training." The old man studied the photograph for a long moment, then set down his whittling knife. "Name's Earl. Been running this place since 1945. He gestured toward the diary visible through Marcus's car window. "That his writing you got there?" "His diary. Found it in my mother's belongings after she died." Earl was quiet for several minutes, weighing something internal. Finally he stood up, his joints creaking with age. "Pastor Elijah didn't just run. Eden's Rest. He owned half this county by 1947, had the sheriff in his pocket, the mayor eating out of his hand, preached about purification and redemption while building something that wasn't neither." "Where is it?" "The compound. Burned down in 52. Official story was lightning strike, but folks around here knew better." Earl's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some of us watched it burn and didn't call the fire department. By then, We'd heard enough screaming in the night to know what kind of salvation was happening up there. Marcus felt his heart racing. Were there survivors? Did anyone escape? Earl looked at him with something approaching pity. "Son, you sure you want to know what happened to your sisters? Some truths are heavier than the not knowing. I've carried the not knowing for 41 years. I can carry the truth." Earl nodded slowly, understanding something fundamental about the weight men carry. "Follow this road north for about 10 miles. Turn left at the lightning-struck oak. What's left of Eden's Rest is up in those hills." The lightning-struck oak stood like a skeletal finger pointing toward the hills, its blackened trunk split down, the middle by some long-ago storm. Marcus turned his Pontiac onto what had once been a road, but was now little more than 2 tire ruts overgrown with kudzu and wild grass. The deeper he drove into the woods, the more the canopy closed overhead, filtering the afternoon sunlight into an eerie green twilight. When the trees finally parted, Marcus found himself in a clearing dominated by the skeletal remains of what had once been a substantial compound. Charred foundation stones marked where buildings had stood, their precise rectangular arrangements suggesting careful planning. This hadn't been some ramshackle collection of shacks. Eden's Rest had been built to last, built to contain. Marcus parked and stepped out into the oppressive silence. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place, leaving the air still and heavy with the weight of old horrors. The largest foundation outlined what must have been the main building, perhaps a chapel or assembly hall. Scattered around it were smaller rectangles, dormitories maybe, or workshops, but it was the square foundation at the clearing's edge that made Marcus's stomach clench with recognition. Thick stone walls still stood waist-high, and rusted iron rings were embedded in the masonry, at regular intervals a punishment block, a place where people had been chained. Marcus picked his way carefully through the ruins, his feet crunching on broken glass and debris. Near what had been the main building's entrance, something glinted in the undergrowth. He knelt and brushed away 40 years of accumulated leaves and dirt, revealing a small metal cross, the kind worn on a chain around the neck. His hands shook as he cleaned it off. The cross was simple, inexpensive, the sort of jewelry a teenage girl might wear to show her faith, the kind Ruby had worn every Sunday to Mount Calvary. Deeper in the compound, he found more evidence of the lives that had been lived and lost here. Fragments of cloth caught on tree branches, a rusted hairpin. The remains of what might have been a vegetable garden, now choked with weeds but still showing signs of the careful rows someone had once tended. At the compound's far edge, partially hidden by overgrown brambles, Marcus discovered something that made his blood run cold. A series of small stone markers, crude and weathered, arranged in neat rows like a cemetery. But there were no names on these markers, no dates, just numbers carved into the stone, 723, 1531. Marcus counted 23 markers in total, each representing a life reduced to a number in Pastor Elijah's twisted record-keeping. Somewhere, in this unmarked graveyard, his sisters might be resting. The diner in nearby Crossroads looked like it hadn't changed since the Eisenhower administration. Red vinyl booths, checkerboard floor, and the persistent smell of grease and coffee that had soaked into every surface. Marcus sat in a corner booth, the small metal cross from Eden's Rest wrapped in his handkerchief, on the table beside his untouched pie. "You the man asking about the old compound?" Marcus looked up to see an elderly black man standing beside his table, hat in hand, eyes filled with decades of carried guilt. The man was thin to the point of frailty, with white hair and hands that trembled slightly as he clutched his worn fedora. "Name's Isaiah Walker. Earl down at the gas station said you might want to talk to me." The old man's voice was barely above, a whisper. "I worked up there, at Eden's Rest. Maintenance, groundskeeping, whatever Pastor Elijah needed done." Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. "Please, sit." Isaiah slid into the booth with the careful movements of a man whose body had been broken by hard labor and harder memories. He stared at the cross on the table for a long moment before speaking. "That's one of theirs, ain't it? One of the girls." It wasn't a question. "I think it might have belonged to my sister Ruby. She wore one just like it." Isaiah closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. Ruby Washington, pretty girl with the singing voice, came with her 2 sisters in the spring of 46. He opened his eyes and Marcus saw tears threatening to spill. I remember them. God help me. I remember them all. What happened there, Isaiah? What was Pastor Elijah really doing? Called it purification ministry, but it wasn't nothing pure about it. Isaiah's voice grew stronger, as if speaking the truth was giving him strength. Those girls, they came thinking they was going to learn to be missionaries. Instead, they found themselves in a prison disguised as a church. Isaiah described the daily routine, dawn prayers followed by hours of correction for imagined sins, isolation cells for those who questioned authority, forced labor in the compound's fields and workshops, and worse things, unspeakable things that happened in the main building after dark. Pastor Elijah preached that suffering purified the soul, especially for black women, said they carried extra sin that had to be beaten out of them. Isaiah's hands clenched into fists. I was a coward. I needed the work, needed the money he paid me to keep quiet. So I looked the other way while he destroyed those girls. How many died? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. 23 that I know of. Buried them in that little cemetery you probably found, but... Isaiah hesitated, then leaned forward. Not all of them died up there. Some ran, some got help escaping. There was a network, people who helped girls get away when they could. Marcus felt his heart leap. My sisters, did any of them escape? I can't say for certain. The fire happened so fast, and in all the confusion. Isaiah pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket. There's a woman in Memphis. Name's Grace. She helps women who've been through situations like Eden's Rest. If any of your sisters survived, she might know. Sheriff Robert Hayes stood among the weathered stone markers at Eden's Rest, his face grim as the state crime scene team worked around him with careful precision. Marcus watched from the tree line, Isaiah beside him, both men bearing witness, to the excavation of secrets that had festered in Mississippi soil for 4 decades. This is bigger than we thought, Sheriff Hayes called out to his deputy, his voice carrying across the clearing. The sheriff was a younger man than his predecessor, one who hadn't been in Pastor Elijah's pocket. When Marcus had shown him Isaiah's testimony and the diary entries, Hayes had immediately contacted state authorities. Marcus counted silently, as each numbered marker was carefully documented and photographed. The forensics team worked methodically, their metal detectors sweeping the ground, their cameras capturing every detail. When they began the first excavation at marker number 7, Marcus held his breath. The shallow grave revealed exactly what Isaiah had described: human remains, clearly female, buried without ceremony or respect. A young woman reduced to bones and tattered fabric, her life ended in this forgotten place where evil had masqueraded as salvation. Lord have mercy, Isaiah whispered, making the sign of the cross. But as the team continued their work, a troubling pattern emerged. Of the 23 markers, only 18 contained remains. 5 graves were empty, not recently disturbed, but never used at all. The missing bodies created questions that gnawed at Marcus's consciousness like physical pain. Sheriff Hayes approached them as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Mr. Washington, we're going to need you to look at some personal effects. See if you can identify anything that might have belonged to your sisters. Marcus followed the sheriff to a table where recovered items had been carefully arranged. Child's bracelet, torn fabric from what might have been a dress, a small Bible with water damage obscuring most of its pages, and there, near the edge of the display, a hairpin with tiny pearls embedded in its design. His breath caught in his throat. Pearl had worn pins just like that, had saved money from her church job to buy them for special occasions. This could be hers, but the hope felt almost worse than the despair. Sheriff, one of the forensics technicians called out, we've got something strange here at marker 15. The grave's been dug but never filled, and there are drag marks leading away from the site toward the old road. Marcus felt Isaiah's hand grip his arm. That means someone got away, the old man whispered urgently. Someone escaped before they could bury her. For the first time in 41 years, Marcus allowed himself to hope that one of his sisters might still be alive. The Sunset Manor, nursing home in Memphis, smelled of disinfectant and resignation, its hallways lined with wheelchairs and the whispered conversations of visitors saying goodbye in installments, Marcus found Grace Williams in the facility's garden, a woman in her 70s sitting in a wheelchair beneath the shade of an old magnolia tree, her weathered hands folded in her lap like broken birds. "Mrs. Williams? My name is Marcus Washington. Isaiah Walker said you might be willing to talk to me about Eden's Rest." Grace looked up sharply, her eyes suddenly alert despite her frail appearance. Those eyes held a depth of pain Marcus recognized, the look of someone who had survived what should have killed her. "Isaiah sent you?" Her voice was soft but steady. That old fool still carrying guilt about what happened up there. Marcus pulled out the photograph of his sisters and handed it to her. Grace studied it for a long moment, her fingers tracing the faces with infinite gentleness. "Ruby, Pearl, and little Opal," she said finally. "I remember them. They arrived in spring of 46, just a few months before I escaped." Marcus felt his heart stop. "You knew them? You were there when they came?" "Child, I was there for 2 years before your sisters arrived. Came from a church in Jackson, Mississippi, told I was going to train for missionary work in Africa." Grace's laugh was bitter as old coffee. Pastor Elijah had a way of making hell sound like heaven. She described the compound much as Isaiah. Had the brutal daily routine, the systematic breaking of spirits disguised as spiritual correction. But Grace also spoke of something Isaiah hadn't mentioned, the resistance network that had developed among the women themselves. "We looked out for each other when we could, shared food, shared strength, shared hope, and when opportunities came to escape, we took them." Grace's eyes grew distant. "There was a laundry truck that came twice a week. The driver, a man named Samuel, was sympathetic to our situation. He helped girls escape when he could." "Did he help my sisters?" Grace was quiet for so long Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of carefully guarded secrets. "The night of the fire there was chaos. Pastor Elijah was drunk on his own rage, punishment sessions that went on for hours. Some girls ran into the woods, others—" She paused, studying Marcus's face. "Others had help getting away. Samuel made more than one trip that night." "Are you saying one of my sisters might have escaped?" Grace reached into her wheelchair's side pocket and pulled out a small worn address book. "There's a network, Marcus. People who help women disappear completely when their lives depend on it. If any of your sisters survived Eden's Rest, they might have changed their names, started new lives." She tore out a page and handed it to him. "Start in Philadelphia. Ask for Sarah Chen at the Women's Crisis Center. Tell her Grace sent you." Marcus's Pontiac had become a traveling archive of hope and heartbreak as he followed the underground network that had spirited women away from places like Eden's Rest. The back seat overflowed with notebooks, photographs and scraps of paper, each one a breadcrumb in a trail that stretched across 3 states and 40 years of carefully guarded secrets. In Birmingham, he found Sister Margaret at a Catholic shelter, a nun whose order had quietly aided escapees for decades. She remembered Samuel, the laundry truck driver, and confirmed he had rescued at least 6 women the night Eden's Rest burned. "He brought them here first," she said, studying a faded ledger. 3 went north to Chicago, 2 to Detroit, and 1, she paused, her finger tracing an entry. 1 went to a family in Philadelphia. Young woman, badly traumatized, wouldn't speak for months. In Nashville, Marcus tracked down Samuel's nephew, Jerome, who had helped coordinate the rescues. Jerome was in his 50s now, a mechanic with grease-stained hands and eyes that held old secrets. "Uncle Samuel saved over 30 women in his lifetime," Jerome said, leading Marcus to a storage shed behind his garage. "Kept records of everyone in case families came looking." The wooden filing cabinet contained careful documentation, names, dates, destinations. Most entries used code words rather than real identities, but one caught Marcus's attention immediately. "Robin's Nest, Philadelphia, June 1952. Young songbird, age 25, severe trauma, needs long-term sanctuary." Young songbird. Ruby had been 19 when she disappeared from Detroit, which would make her 25 in 1952, and she had possessed the most beautiful singing voice in Mount Calvary's choir. "What's Robin's Nest?" Marcus asked, his pulse quickening. "Safe. House run by a woman named Eleanor Patterson. She specialized in helping women completely disappear. New names, new identities, new lives. If someone needed to vanish entirely, Eleanor made it happen. In Louisville, Marcus found Eleanor's former assistant, now running her own shelter. She remembered Robin's Nest vividly, a sprawling Victorian house where broken women learned to live again. Eleanor died in 1978, the woman explained, but she kept meticulous records. Her daughter might still have them. Each stop brought Marcus closer to an impossible truth. The network had been vast, sophisticated, and utterly committed to protecting women who had escaped unthinkable horrors. And somewhere in this web of compassion and secrecy, one of his sisters might have found safety. By the time Marcus reached the Pennsylvania border, his hands trembled with anticipation. Philadelphia held answers. He could feel it in his bones. After 41 years of searching for the dead, he was about to discover whether any of his sisters had managed to live. The highway stretched ahead like a promise, carrying him toward a truth that would change everything. The house on Carpenter Street was modest but well-maintained, with a small garden where late summer flowers bloomed in careful rows. Marcus sat in his car across the street, studying the address Eleanor Patterson's daughter had given him, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird, desperate for flight. A woman emerged from the house to water her plants, and Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. Even after 41 years, even with grey threading through her hair and lines etched around her eyes, he knew that careful way she moved, that precise attention to detail that had always marked his middle sister. Pearl. She looked up as his car door slammed shut, and their eyes met across the narrow street. The watering can dropped from her hands, water spreading across the concrete walkway as she stared at the ghost of her brother walking toward her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "Marcus, is it really?" He crossed the street like a man moving through deep water, 41 years of grief and hope colliding in his chest. When he reached the garden gate, they stood frozen for a moment, two people who had been carved apart by evil and somehow impossibly found each other again. Pearl. Her name came out broken, barely recognizable. "I go by Patricia now," she said, automatically, then laughed through sudden tears. "Patricia Chen. I've been Patricia Chen for 35 years. They moved toward each other simultaneously, meeting in an embrace that held decades of loss and love. Marcus felt her shoulders shake with sobs, felt his own tears soaking into her hair as they held each other with the desperate grip of survivors. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his shoulder. "All of you. When Eden's Rest burned, when I escaped, I thought Pastor Elijah had killed everyone. I've been living like a ghost, afraid to contact home, afraid they'd find me and drag me back." Marcus pulled away enough to see her face, to trace the features that had haunted his dreams for 4 decades. "Mama never stopped hoping. She died 3 months ago, still believing you'd come home someday." Pearl's face crumpled. "She waited for us? All this time?" She kept Pastor Elijah's diary hidden in her things. "That's how I found the trail that led me to you." Marcus took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of a life rebuilt from nothing. "Pearl, I need to know. What happened to Ruby and Opal? Did they escape too?" The hope in his voice broke something in her expression, and Marcus saw the answer in her eyes before she spoke. "We need to go inside," she said quietly. "There are things you need to know, terrible things." Pearl's living room was filled with the quiet dignity of a life rebuilt from ashes, family photographs of the husband and children she'd made after escaping hell, bookshelves lined with volumes on healing and faith, a piano where she'd slowly learned to sing again. Marcus sat beside her on the couch, holding her hands as she gathered strength to speak truths that had lived in darkness for 4 decades. "Ruby fought them until the end," Pearl began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "She never stopped being our sister, never stopped trying to protect us. The night Pastor Elijah came for her final correction session, she grabbed a broken piece of pottery and slashed his face open. That's when he..." She paused, swallowing hard. "That's when he killed her, with his bare hands, while Opal and I watched." Marcus felt something die inside him, a hope he'd carried so long it had become part of his skeleton. And Opal? Little Opal lasted 3 more months, but she was never the same after watching Ruby die. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, just faded away like a flower in winter. I held her when she died, sang the lullabies Mama used to sing to us. They sat in silence for a long moment, mourning sisters who had been murdered by a man who'd hidden evil behind scripture. Finally, Pearl continued. The night Eden's Rest burned, it wasn't lightning like they claimed. Some of the local men, they'd finally heard enough screaming from that compound. They came with gasoline and matches. She looked at Marcus with fierce gratitude. Samuel the laundryman was waiting with his truck. He pulled me out of that hell and drove me to Eleanor Patterson's safe house. Why didn't you ever try to contact home? Pastor Elijah had convinced us that our families had abandoned us, that we'd brought shame on everyone we loved. And I was so broken, Marcus. It took years before I could even remember my real name without panic. Pearl squeezed his hands. By then, I thought it was too late. I thought everyone had moved on. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the contact information for Sheriff Hayes in Mississippi. It's not too late for justice. The authorities have reopened the case. Your testimony could help convict everyone who was involved. Pearl stared at the phone for a long moment, then nodded with the strength that had kept her alive through unspeakable horrors. Ruby and Opal deserve justice. And maybe... She looked around her peaceful home, then back at her brother. Maybe... It's time Patricia Chen stopped hiding and Pearl Washington came home. Outside, Philadelphia's evening light painted the windows gold, illuminating 2 survivors ready to honor their dead and reclaim their family name.